The Wyoming Territory wine bit like a cornered wolf. Annie shivered, clutching her valise on the desolate train platform. The telegram crinkling in her pocket was brief. Train delayed. Wait. But that was yesterday. Ain't no one coming for you, sweet pea, a grizzled station master had sneered earlier. That fancy boy fiancé of yours took the stage to Denver. Annie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Left. Abandoned. Well, ain't this a dusty little predicament? A voice drawled from the shadows of the depot. A man leaned against the rough-hewn wood, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. Looks like you're looking for someone, and I'm looking at you. His gaze was bold, taking in her travel-stained dress. Name's Silas. Maybe I can help a fellow traveler find his, or her, way. Annie stiffened. I am waiting for someone. He will be here. Silas chuckled, a low, rasping sound. Sure he will, darling. Sure he will. He pushed off the wall. But if he don't, well, I know a few trails out of this dust bowl. He winked, tipping his hat before sauntering away. Annie watched him go. A shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. The mountains loomed, jagged teeth against a bruising sky. Annie trudged upward, the station master's cruel laugh echoing in her ears. She had hired a dubious guide, a silent man named Cleet, who promised to take her to her intended's cabin. She would demand answers. Not much further? Cleet grunted over his shoulder, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The trail narrowed, barely a scratch along the canyon wall. Below, the river was a ribbon of churning silver. Watch your step, Cleet warned, dislodging a cascade of pebbles that clattered into the abyss. Annie tightened her grip on her skirts, her city-soft boots slipping on the scree. The air grew thinner, biting her lungs. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Not a rifle, a pistol. Close, Cleet cursed, dropping low. Annie froze. Another shot, then a heavy thud, followed by a sickening sound of rolling rock and breaking branches. Stay here, Cleet hissed, drawing his own weapon and creeping forward. Annie huddled against the canyon wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, a groan. She crept forward, peering around the bend. Cleet was gone. But down the slope, snagged in a tangle of scrub oak, was a man, not Cleet. He was huge, a mountain of buckskin and fur, lying impossibly still. A dark stain spread across his side, stark against the pale leather. Annie scrambled down the precarious slope, heedless of the tearing thorns and biting rocks. She reached him, gasping. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He was rugged, bearded, smelling of pine and blood. Mister? Annie whispered, her voice trembling. His eyes snapped open, ice blue, fierce and feral. He gripped her wrist with shocking strength. Get away, he ground out, coughing. Blood flecked his lips. You're hurt, Annie said, forcing her panic down. I have to stop the bleeding. He tried to push her away, but his strength failed. He slumped back, unconscious. Annie ripped the hem of her petticoat, her hands shaking as she bound the wound. She was a city girl, a teacher, not a frontier nurse. But out here, she was all he had. It took everything she had to drag him. Jack. That was the name etched into his rifle stock. Jack. She fashioned a crude travois from fallen branches and her cloak, hauling him foot by agonizing foot until they reached a small, sturdy cabin tucked into a grove of aspen. Inside, it was Spartan. A bunk, a stove, a table. It smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Annie managed to get him onto the bunk. He was feverish, muttering deliriously in a language she didn't understand. She found a bucket, hauled water from the nearby stream, and began the arduous task of cleaning his wound. The bullet had passed clean through, but the infection was setting in. Days bled into nights. Annie barely slept, her world reduced to the rise and fall of Jack's chest, the heat of his skin, the frantic beat of his pulse. She boiled willow bark, remembering a remedy from an old book, and forced the bitter tea past his lips. She scavenged his stores, jerky, beans, dried apples, stretching them as far as they would go. She chopped wood, her soft hands blistering and callousing. She learned to bank the fire, to listen to the sounds of the mountain, the mournful howl of a wolf, the sharp crack of freezing timber. One evening, as she bathed his face with a cool cloth, his eyes fluttered open. The feral light was gone, replaced by a hazy confusion. Who? He croaked, his voice raw. Annie, she said softly. You were shot. I brought you here. He stared at her, taking in her disheveled hair, her soot-stained dress, the weariness etched into her face. Why? Because, Annie said, wiping a tear from her cheek, I didn't have anywhere else to go. Chapter 3. The Awakening. Jack's recovery was slow. He was a silent man, his words measured and few. But his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin. You shouldn't be here, he said one afternoon, watching her mend his torn buckskin. I know, Annie replied, biting off a thread. I was supposed to be married, in Bitter Creek. Jack scoffed softly. Bitter Creek ain't no place for a woman like you. A woman like me. Soft, city. He paused. Though you've got grit, I'll give you that. Annie flushed. My fiancé. He wasn't there. Jack's gaze sharpened. Name? Thomas Sterling. A muscle twitched in Jack's jaw. Sterling. He's a tin horn, a gambler. Left town a week ago owing money to half the county. Annie dropped the needle, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. She had sold everything, crossed the country, for a lie. I'm sorry, Jack said. And for the first time, she heard genuine rough sympathy in his voice. What do I do now? Annie whispered, feeling the walls of the small cabin closing in. You heal? Jack said, his eyes holding hers, like I did. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching the bruised skin on her wrist where he had gripped her on the mountain. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to his rugged exterior. I owe you my life, Annie, he said softly. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken. Annie looked at his hand, then up at his face. The ice-blue eyes were no longer cold. You don't owe me anything, she managed to say. I do, Jack insisted. And Jack doesn't forget a debt. This first part establishes the stark reality of Annie's situation and the immediate, visceral connection between her and Jack. The setting is hostile, reflecting their internal struggles. Jack is introduced as a man of few words, but strong actions. A true mountain man. Annie, despite her initial vulnerability, reveals a hidden core of resilience. The reveal about her fiancé sets the stage for her emotional journey. The tension between them shifts from survival to something deeper. The dialogue snippet with Silas in the opening hints at the dangerous, unpredictable nature of the West, where societal norms are often fluid or ignored entirely. I wanted to create a sense of isolation that forces these two disparate characters together, making their developing bond inevitable but complicated. The first frost arrived like a thief in the night. It painted the cabin windows with intricate, icy ferns and hardened the mud outside into unyielding iron. Annie stood in the doorway, her breath pluming in the crisp morning air. She wrapped her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The Wyoming mountains, previously painted in fiery autumn golds, were now stripped bare, bracing for the brutal winter ahead. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. Jack was out of bed. His recovery had been a stubborn, silent battle. He pushed himself daily, ignoring the grimaces of pain that flashed across his weathered face. Today, he was fully dressed in his heavy buckskins, pulling his boots on with agonizing slowness. You should stay off that leg, Annie said, turning around. Her voice was firm, adopting the authoritative tone she used to use in her classroom back east. Jack looked up, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. Wood won't chop itself, teacher. I can chop it. I have been for 3 weeks. You've blistered your hands to ribbons, Jack countered, standing up. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the edge of the rough-hewn table. It's my turn. Annie stepped forward instinctively, her hands hovering near his arms, ready to catch him. He didn't pull away. For a fleeting moment, the distance between them vanished. She smelled the sharp scent of pine needles and the clean, masculine sweat on his skin. He looked down at her, his ice-blue eyes unreadable. I'm healing, Annie. Because of you. You are stubborn, she whispered, stepping back, suddenly hyper-aware of the small confines of the cabin. Survival requires a hard head, he said, moving toward the door. Grab your coat. If you're going to stay in this territory, you need to learn how to shoot. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the clearing. The air bit at Annie's exposed cheeks. Jack handed her his heavy Winchester rifle. It felt cold and foreign in her hands, a brutal instrument of iron and oiled wood. Tuck it into your shoulder, Jack instructed, stepping behind her. Tight, or it'll kick you hard enough to break a collarbone. He reached around her, his massive hands covering hers to adjust her grip. His chest pressed lightly against her back. Annie's breath hitched. It was a purely practical gesture, yet the heat radiating from him was a stark contrast to the freezing wind. Look down the sights, he murmured, his voice a low rumble right next to her ear. See that pine cone on the stump? Don't look at the barrel. Look at the target. Be the target. Annie squeezed her eyes shut, aiming. I have never killed anything. You aren't killing, Jack said softly. You're defending. Out here, the line between the two is paper thin. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Annie exhaled, her finger tightening. The rifle roared, a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The recoil punched her shoulder violently, sending her stumbling backward. Jack caught her instantly, his strong arm wrapping around her waist, steadying her. They both looked at the stump. The pine cone was completely obliterated, scattered into a dozen wooden shrapnel pieces. Jack chuckled, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to thaw the frigid air around them. Well now, remind me never to cross you, Miss Annie. Annie rubbed her aching shoulder, a breathless, triumphant laugh escaping her lips. I warned you. I am a fast learner. He didn't let go of her waist immediately. His smile faded, replaced by a profound, searching look. I know, he said quietly. That's what scares me. By December, the snow was waist deep. It fell for 3 days straight, a blinding white curtain that isolated the cabin from the rest of the world. The interior of the cabin became their entire universe. The roaring fire was their sun. They fell into a quiet, domestic rhythm. Jack carved new snowshoes from flexible ash wood. Annie mended clothes and baked hardtack bread from their dwindling flour supply. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was comfortable, thick with unspoken understanding. Annie realized she hadn't thought of Thomas Sterling in weeks. The betrayal still stung, but the man himself felt like a phantom from a different lifetime. One afternoon, a sharp sound shattered the peace. It wasn't the wind. It was the frantic barking of dogs, followed by the heavy, rhythmic crunch of snowshoes approaching the porch. Jack dropped his carving knife. In a heartbeat, the relaxed man vanished, replaced by the feral predator Annie had found on the mountain. He grabbed the Winchester, livering a round into the chamber with a metallic clack. Get behind the stove, Jack ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Annie scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the counter, her knuckles turning white. A heavy fist pounded on the heavy oak door. Knock, knock, little bird, a voice sang out from the freezing cold. It was theatrical, melodic, and dripping with malicious glee. Is it too cold for a house call? Annie froze. She knew that voice. It was the man from the train depot. Silas, I know you're in there, sweetheart. Silas drawled through the thick timber. And I know you brought a fat little dowry from out east to give to that handsome, useless fiancé of yours. Since Tommy Boy ran out on his debts, I'm here to collect what's mine. Jack moved silently to the window, peering through a crack in the frost-covered glass. There are 2 of them, Jack whispered to Annie. One is the fancy talker. The other looks like the guide who left me to die on the ridge. Annie gasped. Cleet. Cleet hadn't run away in fear. He had been part of an ambush. He had shot Jack, likely to rob him, and now he had brought Silas to rob her. Open the door, honey, Silas called out, his tone shifting from playful to venomous. Don't make my boys freeze their pretty little toes off out here. We can do this the easy way, or we can smoke you out like badgers. Jack backed away from the window, his eyes locking onto Annie's. Do you trust me? Yes, Annie breathed, her voice trembling but resolute. When I open this door, Jack said, his voice hard as flint, you stay low. Do not hesitate. He reached to his belt and pulled out his heavy Colt revolver, sliding it across the floorboards to her. Annie picked up the gun. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of gun oil. She remembered the pine cone. You aren't killing? You're defending. Jack gripped the iron latch of the door. The wood groaned under the pressure of the wind outside. Last chance, darlings, Silas yelled. I'm losing my fabulous patience. Jack threw the latch and kicked the door open. The door slammed against the interior wall with a violent crash. The blinding white glare of the snowfield rushed into the dim cabin, along with a blast of freezing wind. Silas stood on the porch, wrapped in a flamboyant, fur-lined coat, a silver-plated pistol casually resting in his hand. Behind him, holding the dog sled reins, was Cleet, his face scarred and grim. Jack didn't say a word. He brought the Winchester up in a fluid, lightning-fast motion. Cleet was faster. He dropped the reins and raised his shotgun. Fire and smoke erupted in the doorway. Jack jerked backward as a spray of buckshot shredded the doorframe next to his head, wooden splinters flying like shrapnel. Jack fired back, a deafening roar. Cleet cried out, dropping his weapon and clutching his shoulder, falling backward into the deep snow. Silas shrieked, a high-pitched sound of fury. You ruined my coat. He raised his silver pistol, aiming squarely at Jack's chest. Jack, still recovering from the recoil, was exposed. He wouldn't be able to lever another round in time. Time seemed to slow down for Annie. She saw the silver barrel glinting in the pale winter sun. She saw Jack's broad back, the man who had sheltered her, fed her, and treated her with more respect than any man in her life. She raised the Colt revolver over the top of the iron stove. She didn't look at the barrel. She looked at Silas's sneering face. Be the target. Annie pulled the trigger. The recoil sent her crashing to the floor, her ears ringing violently. The cabin filled with acrid, choking blue smoke. Through the haze, she heard a heavy thud. Annie scrambled to her hands and knees, peering around the stove, her vision swimming. Silas was lying flat on his back on the snowy porch, his silver pistol lost in the snowdrift. He was clutching his leg, screaming in agony, a bright red stain spreading rapidly across his expensive fur coat. Cleet, seeing his employer down and bleeding, scrambled to his feet. Gripping his wounded shoulder, he abandoned the dogs and ran, plunging into the tree line, leaving deep, frantic tracks in the snow. Jack stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. He slowly lowered his rifle, staring at Silas writhing on the porch, then turned to look at Annie. She was sitting on the floor, the heavy revolver shaking in her hands, her eyes wide with shock at what she had just done. Jack walked over to Silas, kicking the silver pistol off the porch and into the snowbank. You're lucky she's a better person than me, Jack growled at the weeping man. I would have aimed higher. Bind your leg and crawl back to town. If I ever see your face on this mountain again, you won't leave it. Silas didn't offer a witty retort. He dragged himself backward, sobbing, terrified of the giant mountain man towering over him. Jack shut the shattered door, plunging the cabin back into dim, smoky silence. He dropped his rifle on the table and walked straight to Annie. He didn't speak. He just knelt on the floor beside her, taking the hot, smoking revolver gently from her trembling hands and setting it aside. Then he pulled her into his chest. Annie collapsed against him, burying her face in the soft buckskin of his coat, finally letting out a ragged sob. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her weak and terrified. Jack held her tight, his massive hand stroking her hair. He rested his chin on the top of her head, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. You're safe, he whispered into her hair, his voice choked with raw emotion. I swear to you, Annie, you are safe. He had promised to repay his debt to her. But as he held her shaking body against his, Jack realized the debt had changed. He wasn't just protecting the woman who saved his life. He was protecting the woman who had stolen his heart. This part focuses heavily on the shift from survival to partnership. In Chapter 4, the shooting lesson is a classic trope, but I used it to force physical proximity and highlight Annie's transition from a passive victim of her circumstances to an active participant in her survival. Chapter 5 brings the outside world crashing in. I brought Silas back to fulfill the request for specific, flamboyant dialogue. Knock, knock, little bird, contrasting his theatrical menace with Jack's silent, deadly nature. The twist that Cleet was the one who shot Jack ties the two seemingly random events of Part 1 together. Annie's abandonment and Jack's injury are connected by greed. In Chapter 6, Annie takes the shot. This is a massive consequence for her character. She crosses a moral line to save Jack, cementing their bond. Jack's reaction at the end shows how his motivation has shifted entirely from duty, debt, to deep, protective love. The deep freeze finally broke in late March. The relentless howling of the winter wind softened into a gentle, persistent dripping. Water ran down the icicles hanging from the eaves, splashing into the muddy earth below. Inside the cabin, the heavy tension of winter had melted away, replaced by a delicate, fragile peace. Yet, Annie struggled to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glint of Silas's silver pistol. She heard the deafening roar of the Colt revolver in her own hands. She would wake up gasping, her hands phantom-heavy with the weight of the gun. One evening, the nightmares came before she even reached the bed. She stood by the wash basin, scrubbing her hands with harsh lye soap long after the water had turned cold. Her knuckles were raw and pink. A large, warm hand closed over hers. Jack gently took the soap from her trembling fingers. He didn't say a word. He just dipped a clean rag into the basin and began to carefully wash her hands, rinsing away the suds with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It doesn't wash off, Annie whispered, staring at the dark water. The feeling. I shot a man, Jack. You stopped a monster, Jack corrected, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet cabin. He dried her hands with a linen towel. He would have killed me, Annie, and then he would have taken you. You did what the mountain demanded. I am a teacher, she said, a tear finally spilling over her lashes. I taught children poetry and sums. Now, I am someone who pulls a trigger. Jack sighed, a heavy, ragged sound. He guided her to the rough-hewn bench near the stove and sat beside her. The firelight danced across his scarred, bearded face. When I first came to this mountain, I was running, Jack said softly, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. I was a deputy down in Colorado. I had a wife, Sarah. Annie's breath caught. He had never mentioned his past. She sat perfectly still, afraid to shatter the moment. A gang of rustlers came through. Jack continued, his voice tight with old agony. I was young, proud. Thought I could handle them all myself. I locked Sarah in the root cellar and went out to be a hero. He swallowed hard. They bypassed me, set fire to the house while I was pinned down in the barn. I couldn't get to her in time. Oh, Jack, Annie breathed, her heart breaking for the pain etched deep in his eyes. I came up here to punish myself, he confessed, turning to look at her. To live in the cold and the quiet until the mountain took me. That's why I didn't fight back when Cleet ambushed me on the ridge. I thought it was finally my time. He reached out, his calloused fingertips gently brushing a stray curl from her cheek. Then I woke up, and an angel with blistered hands was pouring bitter tea down my throat. He whispered, You saved my life, Annie. But more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live it again. Annie leaned into his touch. The guilt of the shooting began to recede, replaced by a profound, overwhelming warmth. You are not a bad man, Jack, she said fiercely. And I am not ruined, because I protected you. He leaned in slowly. Annie closed her eyes, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. His lips met hers. It was a gentle, hesitant kiss at first, asking for permission. Annie answered by tangling her fingers in his thick hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, desperate and consuming, sealing a bond forged in blood, snow, and survival. They were no longer two broken people hiding from the world. They were healed. By mid-April, the snowpack had receded enough to make the trail passable. Their supplies were critically low. The flour barrel was empty, and the coffee tin contained nothing but dust. It was time to leave the sanctuary of the cabin. Annie stood on the porch, wearing her heavy wool traveling dress, patched and mended over the long winter. She looked out at the valley, now blooming with vibrant green mountain grass and patches of purple lupine. You ready? Jack asked, stepping out behind her. He wore his heavy gun belt, the Winchester slung casually over his broad shoulder. He looked like the wild mountain man she had found, but the harshness in his eyes was gone. I think so, Annie said, taking a deep breath of the crisp spring air. But I will miss this place. It's not going anywhere, Jack said, offering her his arm. And neither are we. But we need beans, and you need proper boots. The descent was arduous. The trail was choked with thick, slippery mud and runoff from the melting snow. Jack led the way, his steps sure and steady, his limp completely gone. He frequently reached back, offering his large hand to help Annie over washed-out roots and swollen streams. It took them 2 days of hard trekking to reach the valley floor. As they approached the outskirts of Bitter Creek, the smell hit Annie first. It was a potent mixture of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and stale beer. A jarring contrast to the sharp, clean scent of the high pines. The town was a muddy scar on the landscape. Wooden storefronts with false facades lined a deeply rutted main street. Wagons lumbered through the muck, and the boardwalks were crowded with rough-looking miners, weary travelers, and opportunistic merchants. Annie instinctively shrank closer to Jack. The noise and the crowds were overwhelming after months of profound isolation. Jack felt her hesitation. He placed a reassuring hand over hers where it gripped his forearm. Keep your head up, Annie. You survived the deep winter. These folks are nothing but noise. They drew stares as they walked down the boardwalk. Jack was an imposing figure, towering over most men, his buckskins marking him as a man of the high country. Annie, despite her mended clothes, held herself with the quiet dignity of an Eastern schoolteacher. First stop, the Mercantile, Jack muttered, steering them toward a large building with a faded sign that read, O'Malley's Provisions. We'll get a room at the boarding house after. They stepped out of the glaring spring sunlight and into the dim, dusty interior of the store. It smelled strongly of oiled canvas, cinnamon, and chewing tobacco. Annie moved toward a display of sturdy leather boots, running her fingers over the smooth material. She felt a sudden pang of anxiety. Returning to civilization meant facing the reality of her situation. She had no money, no job, and legally, she was still betrothed to a ghost. "Find something you like?" Jack asked, coming up behind her. "They're too expensive," Annie whispered, looking at the price tag. "I brought pelts," Jack said, tapping a heavy burlap sack he had carried down the mountain. "Winter fox and prime beaver, I can buy out half this store." Before Annie could argue, the bell above the mercantile door jingled violently. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden floorboards. "O'Malley, I need a bottle of rye and another extension on my credit." A frantic, reedy voice shouted from the front counter. Annie froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold and clammy. She knew that voice. It belonged to the man who had promised her a grand house, a loving marriage, and a fresh start in the West. It was the voice from the letters she had read 100 times on the train. Jack saw the terror in her eyes. He stepped in front of her, instinctively shielding her from view, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. Annie peeked around Jack's broad shoulder. Standing at the counter was Thomas Sterling. He looked nothing like the handsome, wealthy gentleman from the tintype photograph he had mailed her. He was gaunt, his tailored suit stained and ragged. His eyes were wild, darting around the store with the paranoid energy of a hunted animal. "I told you, Sterling," the store owner grumbled from behind the counter. "No more credit. Silas's boys came through here looking for you. You're a dead man walking if you don't pay up." "I have money coming," Thomas pleaded, slamming a fist on the counter. "My fiancée. She's arriving from Boston with a dowry, $3,000, as soon as she gets here." "Your fiancée arrived 6 months ago, Thomas?" A calm, icy voice interrupted. Thomas spun around, his hand dropping toward a cheap pistol tucked into his waistband. Jack stepped out from the shadows of the aisles, pushing his coat back to reveal the heavy Colt on his hip. Annie stepped out beside him, her chin held high despite the furious trembling in her knees. Thomas blinked, his mouth falling open in shock. "Annie?" he gasped. He looked from her to the massive mountain man at her side, a calculating gleam replacing the panic in his eyes. "You abandoned me," Annie said, her voice echoing in the quiet store. The anger she had buried all winter finally flared to life. "You left me at the station to face your debts." "Annie, my darling, please," Thomas stammered, taking a step toward her with his hands raised pleadingly. "It was a misunderstanding. I had to secure our investments. I was coming back for you." He looked at Jack, attempting a sickly smile. "Thank you, friend, for looking after my future wife. I'll take her from here." Jack didn't move an inch. He stared at Thomas with the cold, dead eyes of a predator. "She's not going anywhere with you." Thomas's smile vanished, replaced by a desperate, ugly sneer. "Now listen here, you unwashed savage. We have a legal contract, a binding proxy marriage agreement. She is my property, and so is her dowry." He reached into his coat pocket. Jack drew his gun so fast, it was a blur of motion. The heavy barrel leveled directly at Thomas's face. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked sounded like a cannon shot in the silent store. "Pull a piece of paper out of that pocket, and you'll never read again," Jack growled softly. Thomas froze, his hand trembling inside his coat. "You can't do this. I'll go to the sheriff. I'll have you hanged for kidnapping." "Go," Jack challenged, his voice dripping with lethal calm. "Tell the sheriff. Tell him you want to claim the woman who put a bullet in Silas's leg to protect me. I'm sure Silas's gang in the saloon next door would love to hear exactly where Thomas Sterling is standing." Thomas paled, the last of his bravado evaporating. He realized the trap. If he made a scene, his creditors would find him. If he fought Jack, he would die. "You have no dowry, Thomas," Annie said firmly, stepping out from behind Jack. "The bank in Boston seized it the day after I left to cover the fraudulent checks you wrote. You have nothing." Thomas stared at her, utterly defeated. The ghost that had haunted Annie for 6 months was just a pathetic, desperate man. He slowly pulled his empty hand from his pocket, backed away toward the door, and bolted out into the muddy street, fleeing Bitter Creek for good. Jack lowered his gun, letting the hammer down with a soft click. He turned to Annie, the lethal coldness melting from his eyes, replaced by deep, fierce affection. "Well," Jack said mildly, "now that that's settled, let's buy you those boots." This section pivots from internal survival to external resolution. Chapter 7 deals with the psychological consequences of violence, a crucial element for character depth. Annie isn't a seasoned gunslinger. Shooting Silas traumatized her. Jack's backstory about his late wife Sarah provides the profound meaning and explains his initial death wish, showing how Annie truly healed his soul, not just his body. Chapter 8 highlights the jarring transition from their pure, isolated world back to the corrupt civilization of the West, using sensory details like the smell of the town. Chapter 9 delivers the requested plot twist. Thomas Sterling isn't a suave mastermind. He's a pathetic, cornered rat. Jack uses his brain, not just his brawn, to defeat Thomas by weaponizing Thomas's own debts and cowardice against him. Annie's revelation about the dowry strips Thomas of his power, proving she is no longer a victim but an active participant in her own fate. The new boots were sturdy, practical, and laced up tight over Annie's ankles. They felt strange after months of wearing patched leather moccasins, but they grounded her in the reality of Bitter Creek. After securing a room at the small, relatively clean boarding house run by a stern widow named Mrs. Gable, Jack left to settle his business. Annie stayed in the room, relishing her first real bath in half a year. The hot water and rose-scented soap felt like unimaginable luxury. When Jack returned hours later, he looked grim. He tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the bed. It clinked with the distinct sound of gold coins. "O'Malley gave me a fair price for the pelts," Jack said, unbuckling his gun belt and laying it on the dresser. "But we have a problem." Annie paused in brushing her wet hair. "Thomas?" "He's gone. Hitched a ride on a freight wagon heading east," Jack said, his expression troubled. "It's Silas." Annie's stomach plummeted. She had hoped the shot she fired on the mountain had ended that nightmare. "Did he die?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "No," Jack said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He made it back to town. He lost the leg, Annie. The doctor had to amputate below the knee." Annie closed her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. She had permanently maimed a man. The guilt, which she thought she had laid to rest in the cabin, flared back to life. "He's been telling anyone who will listen that a wild mountain man and his deranged woman ambushed him in cold blood." Jack continued softly. "The sheriff is asking questions. O'Malley told me the deputies are planning to pay us a visit tomorrow. But he attacked us," Annie protested, her eyes flying open. "He came to rob me. He threatened us both." "I know that. You know that," Jack said, his jaw tightening. "But Silas has friends in this town. Powerful friends who don't care about the truth, only about saving face. It's his word against ours." He looked at the pouch of gold coins, then up at Annie. "We can't stay here, Annie," he said, his voice heavy with the realization. "If we stay, I'll end up in a cell or worse, and I won't let them take you." "Then we leave," Annie said instantly, the decision clear in her mind. "We buy what we need, and we go back up the mountain." Jack smiled, a sad, slow curve of his lips. "It's not that simple. We can't hide up there forever. They'll come looking eventually. We need a clean break, a new start." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the smooth skin of her wrist. "I bought 2 tickets on the stagecoach heading west to Oregon," he said softly. "It leaves at dawn. We can take the gold, start a farm, maybe build a real house." Annie stared at him, her heart tearing in 2 directions. Oregon. A fresh start. But it meant leaving the mountain. It meant leaving the place where they had found each other. "But your cabin," she whispered. "Your home." "My home isn't a place, Annie," Jack said, his ice blue eyes burning with quiet intensity. "It hasn't been for a long time. My home is wherever you are." Dawn broke over Bitter Creek in a wash of pale, bruised colors. The town was eerily quiet as Jack and Annie stood by the stagecoach depot. Their new supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and a few bolts of calico cloth, were loaded onto the roof of the Concord coach. Jack handed the station agent their tickets. The man, a tired-looking clerk with ink-stained fingers, barely glanced at them. "You folks heading all the way to Portland?" the clerk mumbled, stamping their stubs. "That's the plan," Jack replied, his gaze constantly scanning the empty street, watching for any sign of the sheriff or Silas's men. Annie stood close to him, the cold morning air biting through her new wool coat. She felt a knot of anxiety tight in her chest. Every creak of the boardwalk, every distant dog bark, felt like a threat. "Boarding!" the driver yelled, climbing up to the box and grabbing the reins of the 6-horse team. Jack helped Annie into the cramped interior of the coach. They were the only passengers so far. Jack took the seat opposite her, his Winchester resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the window. The coach lurched forward, the heavy wheels grinding against the frozen mud of the street. They rolled past the saloons, the mercantile, the boarding house. They were leaving Bitter Creek behind. As they reached the edge of town, the rising sun crested the horizon, casting a blinding light across the plains. Annie looked back, her eyes drawn up to the jagged peaks of the mountains in the distance. They looked cold, formidable, and utterly beautiful. "I'll miss it," she admitted softly, turning back to Jack. "Oregon is green," Jack said, trying for a reassuring smile. "Big trees, lots of rain, good soil for farming." "I don't know the first thing about farming," Annie said, a small, genuine laugh escaping her. "Neither do I," Jack admitted, his smile widening. "But we'll learn, together." The stagecoach picked up speed, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels a steady heartbeat beneath them. The tension in the air began to ease, replaced by the tentative hope of a new beginning. They traveled for days, the landscape shifting from arid plains to rolling hills, then to dense, towering forests. The journey was grueling, filled with dust, jolting ruts, and meager meals at way stations. But they had each other, and that made the hardship bearable. One evening, as they camped near a rushing river, Jack sat by the fire, whittling a piece of soft pine. Annie sat beside him, watching the flames dance. "I've been thinking," Jack said, not looking up from his work. "About what?" "About us," he said softly. He blew the shavings off the wood and handed it to her. It was a small, crudely carved, but recognizable figure of a woman holding a book. "I know I'm not a fancy man," Jack said, his voice dropping low, suddenly shy. "I can't give you a grand house in Boston or a life of ease, but I can promise you that I will always protect you. I will always provide for you." He looked up at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I want you to be my wife, Annie, truly." Annie's breath hitched. She looked down at the small wooden carving, tears pricking her eyes. The pain of Thomas Sterling's betrayal, the fear of the winter, the guilt of the violence, it all melted away in the warmth of Jack's simple, profound declaration. "Yes," she whispered, leaning forward to kiss him. "Yes, Jack, I will." 5 years later, the Willamette Valley was lush and verdant, a stark contrast to the harsh beauty of the Wyoming mountains. Annie stood on the porch of their sturdy, clapboard farmhouse, wiping her hands on her apron. The smell of baking bread drifted through the open door, mingling with the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. In the distance, she could see Jack working in the fields, driving a team of strong draft horses. He looked different now, his beard neatly trimmed, his clothes sturdy denim instead of buckskin. But his broad shoulders and steady strength remained the same. A small boy, no more than 4 years old, came running around the side of the house, his face smudged with dirt, clutching a fistful of dandelions. "Mama, look!" he shouted, his bright blue eyes, so like his father's, shining with excitement. "They're beautiful, Leo." Annie smiled, taking the weeds and tucking them behind her ear. "Did you show your papa?" "Papa's busy with the big horses," Leo said importantly. "But he said he would teach me to ride when I'm bigger." Annie laughed, pulling the boy into a hug. "I'm sure he will." She looked back out at the fields. They had built a good life here. The farm was thriving, they had good neighbors, and the ghosts of Bitter Creek seemed like a distant nightmare. Jack stopped the team at the edge of the field and unhitched them, letting them graze. He wiped his brow with a kerchief and started walking toward the house. Annie watched him approach, her heart swelling with a familiar, deep love. He wasn't just the mountain man who had saved her or the man she had healed. He was her partner, her husband, the father of her child. He reached the porch, his heavy boots thudding softly on the wood. He scooped Leo up in one arm, earning a delighted squeal, and wrapped his other arm around Annie's waist, pulling her close. "Smells good," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Dinner is almost ready," Annie said, leaning into his solid warmth. "How are the fields?" "The soil is rich," Jack said, looking out over their land. "We'll have a good harvest this year." He looked down at her, his expression softening, the harshness of the frontier long gone from his eyes. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "after the harvest is in, maybe we could take a trip back east, just to visit." Annie looked at him surprised. "Back east? Why?" "I know you miss it sometimes," Jack said gently. "The city, the schools. I want you to have everything you ever wanted, Annie." Annie smiled, a deep, contented sigh escaping her. She looked at their son, squirming happily in his father's arms, then out at the green valley they had tamed together. "I have everything I ever wanted right here," she said softly, resting her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The Wyoming wind had blown her off course, stranding her in a harsh, unforgiving wilderness. but it had also blown her into the arms of the only man who truly understood the value of her resilient heart. They had healed each other, and in doing so, they had built a love stronger than any mountain storm. This final part concludes the story by shifting from immediate survival to long-term resolution. Chapter 10 introduces the final complication, the realistic consequence of Annie shooting Silas. The law in the West was often corrupt or easily swayed by those with money or influence. This forces Jack and Annie to make a choice between fighting a losing battle or seeking a new life. Chapter 11 provides the requested emotional payoff. The stagecoach journey symbolizes their transition, and Jack's proposal, using a simple wooden carving instead of a ring, highlights his practical, deeply devoted nature. It's a contrast to the empty promises of Thomas Sterling. Chapter 12 acts as an epilogue. Showing them 5 years later, successful and happy in Oregon, solidifies their happy ending. It proves that the healing they experienced on the mountain wasn't just a temporary trauma bond, but the foundation for a lasting, loving family.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, an abandoned mail-order bride heals Mountain Man, not knowing he will repay with love, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet way kindness and trust grew between two people who were both carrying their own struggles. Sometimes the strongest connections don't begin with grand gestures. They start with simple acts of care, patience, and understanding when someone needs it most. One gentle lesson from this story is that people can have a positive impact on each other in ways they never expect. Have you ever met someone who changed your life through a small act of kindness? And which character or moment resonated with you the most? Maybe there's a chance this week to offer a little patience, encouragement, or support to someone around you. Small actions can mean more than we realize. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and consider liking or subscribing so you can join us for more heartfelt stories ahead.